Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Roxanne Smith. I'm a curatorial assistant at the Whitney, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's edition of Ask a Curator. These events are a chance to hear from Whitney curators about their exhibitions, and then for you all to pose your questions about the art, artists, and ideas about the shows. Tonight's event will also be available soon on our YouTube channel if you'd like to rewatch or share with friends. It's a privilege for me to introduce tonight's speakers, two of my Whitney colleagues, my totally wonderful colleagues, curator Barbara Haskell and senior curatorial assistant Sarah Humphreville. They will be sharing about their exhibition Agnes Pelton, Desert Transcendentalist, which is on view now at the Whitney and closes on November the 1st. My work at the museum is focused on the permanent collection, and I was part of the team responsible for our current show, the Whitney's collection, selections from 1900 to 65, which overlaps in time and in some ways to the themes in the Agnes Pelton exhibition. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Barbara and Sarah, and then I'll be back later to moderate the Q&A portion of the program. If you would like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A feature in Zoom. You click on the icon at the bottom of your screen and then type in your question, and please feel free to submit questions during the talk at any point. I'll be selecting a handful to pose to our speakers at the end of their presentation. Thank you so much again all for joining us tonight, and now I will hand things over to Barbara and Sarah.
Thank you, Roxanne. So next slide. So Agnes Pelton was a visionary artist whose work portrayed her understanding of union with the spiritual divine, what she called perfect consciousness. She was born in Germany of American parents in 1881, but returned to the United States when she was 8 to live with her mother and grandmother. Her life was really overshadowed, as she put it, by several family tragedies. One was the morphine death of her father, overdose, when she was 9. And the other was a very highly publicized sex scandal with her grandmother and the abolitionist preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, that played out in the papers on the front page for 6 months in the late 19th century. And really, as she said, cramped her life and her mother's life. Next. So in the teens, Pelton was part of the New York art world. She exhibited 3 paintings in the famous 1913 Armory show. And she was part of a group of painters that called themselves the Introspectives. She shared with them a distrust of modernity and a desire to find a spiritual life that was behind physical appearances. The work that you see right now, Room Decoration, is the largest of these early paintings that she did that depicted female figures in the landscape, sort of involved in private reverie, communing with nature. This piece in 1917 was made as a mural decoration for the home of an editor in Washington, D.C. And you can see that in this work, as she has evolved in these figure pictures, the landscape begins to take over more and more of the forms. These abstract organic forms that envelop the figure become the dominant motif in the next series of work. Next.
So as Barbara suggested or talked about, Pelton was really involved in the New York art world early in her career. But in 1921, following the death of her mother, she moves out to a rural part of Long Island. She takes up residence in a windmill there and really starts to withdraw from the mainstream art world to some degree. And while she's there, she becomes really interested in the writings of Kandinsky, and then is really inspired by that to begin creating her own abstract paintings, which you see 2 examples of those works here. And she begins these in 1925. And as she's thinking through this and you know, kind of gearing herself up to start making work like this, she's not really trying to charge forward with advancing modernity as such, but is really pursuing abstraction as part of her own spiritual aims and personal growth. And in these abstractions, you really see her interest in the link between emotion and color and also music. You see in the painting on the left that that song is referenced in the work's title, Meadowlark Song, Winter. And then Being maybe isn't quite so obvious, but the subject of the work is air currents, which we see swirling around this egg-like form in the middle. And it's these currents that kind of vibrate that she's really taking as the topic of this painting. We can go to the next.
So Pelton called works like these mental images that came to her in dreams and meditation. She thought of herself almost as a passive receptacle. In moments of repose, she would get an insight, an image that she would write down in her journal and then translate it into canvas later. Both of these works deal with water as the subject matter. And for Pelton, water was a symbol of acquiescence. It was something that, because it didn't have a container of its own and it changed shape, it became for her a symbol of spiritual growth and also the idea of transformation. So the notion of water transforming from a liquid into a vapor or a gas becomes a symbol of her desire to transform herself into somebody that could connect with the spiritual reality, that to leave the material world behind and in her mind join with this perfect consciousness that she considered the divine in nature. Next. That as Pelton's work evolved, she began to include images in the work. So we have a lot of star-like figures that begin to suggest for her the sense of messenger or a guide. The next slide. Here's an example of one of those pictures. So you see the star up in the top portion of the picture as a guide, kind of a goal for spiritual enlightenment. Stargazer has this vessel which illuminated with this divine light, as if somehow signaled for spiritual illumination. And then this bud, which will then flower at the moment of illumination or connection with divine reality. Next.
So as Pelton is developing her personal symbolism and her mature vocabulary, some of her works really start to become quite narrative, like this one, Ami in Egypt. So here we see a swan in the bottom of the painting that symbolizes the female body. And like many of her narrative paintings, this painting has a journey of spiritual enlightenment as its topic. And so we see the swan moving from these kind of dark earthly concerns up the blood red river of life. It's overseen by this really, beautiful gold flower that acts as a protector, but is also a symbol of generation. And then the swan will travel up guided by this star, as Barbara said, that the star is a guide to spiritual enlightenment, and the swan will follow along on that path. We go to the next. So in 1932, Pelton left Long Island and went to Cathedral City, California, which is a kind of suburb of Palm Springs in the Southern Californian desert. And while she's there, she really feels inspired by the desert, that she feels a heightened spiritual awareness there. And at one point, she even talks about how the spirit of California understands her and accepts her. And while she's there, she also really becomes inspired by natural phenomena. And this painting, Sandstorm, is one such work. It's actually the first mature abstraction that she makes in the desert. And she witnessed a sandstorm shortly after arriving and was really inspired by the kind of fury of energy between this, thrashing hard sand, but then pierced with this pale blue sky and an actual rainbow, and felt inspired to create an event and kind of advance herself spiritually through that experience. You can go to the next. So as Pelton's symbolic language is developing, she also is really formulating how to best physically approach her paintings too. So we see in this installation shot a sweep of these mature paintings, all with a prominent blue palette. And if we go to the next, we can look a little bit more of the detail of what she's doing. So, a major feature standing in front of an Agnes Pelton painting is that it really just feels like it glows, and it has this great luminosity and jewel-like quality. And that comes from her using the technique of glazing, which is a method of applying oil paint to canvas in which you use a succession of really, really thin layers of paint. And doing that allows each layer to build up and inform the other, and you get these subtle gradations, like you can see as this form is moving up into these golden feathers. And you also get these kind of really precise kind of glows that you see in the top register of the painting. And so that it's almost like a meditative way of applying the painting. And I think that her process really also speaks to her spiritual aims as well. You can go to the next.
He painted this center gallery of the exhibition blue in order to sort of slow down the viewer experience and allow them to absorb these meditations that Pelton painted about her union with the divine reality, you know, using stars as guides, the feather that you can see in the painting on the far left installed on the wall, that this is a moment where people can slow down and really absorb this, as Sarah said, this very luminous work that really speaks to a spiritual reality beyond the physical. Next. So Mother of Silence, Pelton believed that every person had an aura that suggested their level of transcendence, their level of union with divinity. And in this piece, she's really portraying the mother spirit of the world. To Pelton, the painting was a physical presence. She talked in her journals about turning to it from time to time when she was at a point where she wasn't sure what to do with her painting or her life. So it became almost like a Christian icon to her. She infuses it with this very dramatic glow in order to suggest that this female spirit embodies a kind of union with divinity. And Evensong on the right is again a metaphor. As Sarah said, a number of these pictures really suggest this experience that Pelton had of union with the divine. So you see the star that's really shining up in the upper corner, suggesting the guide to spiritual reality. The urn has been in a lot of course, religions, is used to hold the ashes of the dead. In this case, it's infused again with this spiritual glow that suggests union with the divine in the afterlife. Pelton initially titled this painting Attainment, and then changed the title to Evensong, which is the service at the end of the evening in Christian religions. And it sort of suggests that spiritual enlightenment is not something that one waits for passively, but one actually has to work for in meditation and in practice in order to move beyond the world of material chaos and disorder to this more harmonious, ethereal sensation of being one with the world. Next. Pelton, again, this idea of narrative pictures. This is a piece that she wrote about in her journal. She said it was a kind of pilgrim's progress, guiding viewers from the darkness and oppression of materialism across a stony desert and through symbolic arches to the far off mountains of release. So again, the star in the upper corner that serves as a guide to this world beyond the rational, beyond the material, beyond the oppression of materialism, as she said in her journals. Next. And this is another symbolic picture. It's in memory to her father. It's a kind of Last Judgment picture. She envisions her father lying in the lower portion of the corner, this dark shape, but being awakened to a new life, a rebirth by this glorious, radiant trumpet flower, as she calls it. Next.
So in the mid 1940s, shortly after painting Awakening, which Barbara was just discussing, Pelton began to experience some real health and financial crises, which slowed down her already really laborious painting method. I'm sure from the discussion of glazing, you can imagine just how long it would take her to make a work like this. And she also really felt that she needed to be in the right state of mind in order to do these paintings. But in the late 1940s and through the end of her life, she nevertheless executed a new body of work based on ovals and circles. And, you know, as Barbara was saying in talking about the urn, she's really, you know, developing her own imagery and symbols, but they're often derived from religions and from the theosophical readings that she's doing. And she's interested in theosophy and Agni Yoga and various other occult philosophies. And in these, she's associating in light center on the left, she associates the oval with peace and repose. And then the circle, of course, is, you know, long been a symbol connected with infinity for being a shape that has no beginning and no end. And for Pelton, she also really saw it as a symbol of integration and of unity, and as really being the symbol of the sort of ultimate transcendence, and that its circle really represents a self-contained harmony. And if we go to the next. So these are largely the paintings that she's focusing on at the end of her life, and including in the early 60s. And this is the painting that's left unfinished at the time of her death, also called Light Center, and of course, bearing a striking similarity to the painting with the same title on the previous slide. And here it's subtle, but you can, especially if you come to the galleries before November 1st, you'll be able to see these subtle marks of charcoal that Pelton has on the canvas that are kind of notations to herself, or perhaps suggestions to crop the painting, because she really was worried about her health and energy and was thinking about making it smaller. So this work was left unfinished, as I said. She died in 1961 at the age of 79 from liver cancer, and she really passed away in obscurity, you know, really just known to her kind of local community within Cathedral City, and a few other artists also interested in spiritual matters. It can go to the next.
So as Sarah said, Pelton was really little known during her lifetime. She became part of a group called the New Mexico Transcendentalists, which were also artists that saw in abstract forms an ability to suggest a kind of transcendence beyond the physical. But basically she was very unknown during her lifetime. And the work, as Sarah said, was very laborious. She didn't do many of them. She made a living during her lifetime, initially painting portraits of people on Long Island. And then when she moved to Cathedral City, painting tourist desertscapes. The paintings that really meant something to her were really difficult to achieve. And she saw them not as something having to do with the marketplace. She painted them for herself. So they were her way of clarifying for herself her vision of transcendence and unity with the divine. So although she was little known in her lifetime, the show has had tremendous success at all its stops and at the Whitney as well. And at a time when the world seemed sort of unsettled, to say the least, and people are looking for meaning beyond the physical, it seems like a perfect time to really embrace Pelton and to embrace her position within a group of modernists who were involved in spiritual concerns. That there's a great tradition beginning with Kandinsky, but continuing on through the 20th and 21st century of artists who really want to depict the spiritual and the symbolic in their work. So we're very happy to have it at the Whitney. We would welcome all of you before the show closes on November 1st. And now I'll turn it over to Roxanne and we'll have some questions. Thank you.
And that was wonderful. Thank you, Sarah and Barbara. As we start the Q&A portion, I just wanted to start things off with a question that I've been thinking about, rather in a Peltonian metaphysical spirit, which is that you both obviously have experience curating shows of both living and historical artists, which are obviously quite different experiences, whether the artist is there as a sounding board or to guide your curatorial choices. And Pelton, of course, has now been dead for 60 years. And I'm curious if you could, in a Peltonian way, conjure her spirit in a seance and have a conversation with her as an artist and a curator, what kind of burning questions would you want to channel to her? And obviously she's an artist who already communicates to us so much through the symbology of her paintings and through her diaries. But if you could have had that direct line of communication, what would you have wanted her advice on?
Well, in a way, I think what's wonderful about her pictures is that they show such striving and such yearning for something that's meaningful, that so many of us find the material world dissatisfying, and we yearn for some sort of sense of connection with a world that goes beyond ourselves, that connects with something greater than our individual personality or being. And I think that in the work, Pelton really sets a tone for not necessarily that sense of achievement. It's not as if she's asserting the achievement of connection with the divine reality, but she really suggests a path and a journey toward that. And I think in a way it's very satisfying, the idea that the search itself can be rewarding, and that through these luminous colors and the goal of reaching the star, reaching a sense of perfection, as she called it, that I find that very, very palpable in her work.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if I could ask her questions, I think, what Barbara's sort of hinting at is maybe asking Pelton perhaps for some advice on attaining a certain state of mind. But I mean, I think also, one of the things that I find so interesting in her work is that there's certain symbols that really carry throughout, but sometimes they shift in meaning. And, she's pulling from all different sorts of ideas as she's developing what these things mean to her. And I'd almost just want to kind of sit in a decoding session and listen to her talk about these works.
Also, I think it's interesting. She went to the Southwest, and was in a way the Southwest was a magnet for a lot of spiritual healers. That Krishnamurti, the Theosophy, the outshoots of Theosophy, Eddie Besant was in Pasadena when Pelton was there. So it attracted a lot of people who were interested in more spiritual activities. And Pelton's always been compared with George O'Keeffe because they both went out to the desert. And I think the difference between O'Keeffe and Pelton always thought that O'Keeffe extracted from the external world. She talked about O'Keeffe painting the external world and then making it soft and accessible. But Pelton, on the other hand, really worked from the inside out, whereas O'Keeffe, in a sense, worked from the outside in. But it's interesting, these two women and a lot of other female artists gravitated toward Southern California and the Southwest during the early decades of the 20th century.
I know in our questions from the audience right now, I'm just selecting a handful, but we've gotten a number of questions about another female artist who has been spotlighted at the moment through her show at the Guggenheim last year, Hilma af Klint, and what kinds of comparisons we can draw between, and differences between her and Pelton's work.
Well, I think it's interesting that they both were deeply steeped in occult literature and theosophy, and both of them saw themselves as receptors, that in a way they received images in dreams and meditations, which then they put on canvas. So that they share, I think, with one another. And I think the whole idea, the reason these two women are having such a splash in a way in the United States right now is that people are yearning for some sense that there is a meaning beyond the physical, and that both of these painters who have been previously really excluded from what we would call the canon are now being seen and elevated and are reworking what we think of as being the dominant modes of early abstraction, early international abstraction.
Yeah, and I think it's also, interesting that they both were reading the same texts and interested in the same philosophies, and both arrived at abstraction as a way to achieve their spiritual aims through painting, but that they weren't, they didn't know each other. They weren't aware of each other's work, which I think, is something that really speaks to the richness of how much work is still left to do with this early history of abstraction as well.
We have some other questions about some technical aspects of Pelton's work. In particular, someone asked about her glazing method, and another has asked about whether or not the colors used in her works have a specific sort of unchanging symbology, and whether or not the meaning of those was derived from particular philosophies that she was studying, whether religious or through Kandinsky.
Well, Kandinsky, of course, had the idea that color had specific characteristics that he associated with it. It doesn't seem as if Pelton did to such a degree. She never made a color chart identifying colors with specific emotional expressions. And in terms of the glazing, I'll leave that to Sarah, who's our glazing expert.
Yeah, so I mean, glazing is a really old method of oil painting. I mean, when you look at a Van Eyck painting or, a Dutch Baroque still life or something, and you get those real gleams of color, that's the technique that they're using too. And a lot of people don't necessarily bother with it. It's very, very time consuming. You have to thin down the paint with linseed oil or some other sort of medium, and then you have to wait for that layer to dry completely before you can apply the next one. And then these layers start speaking to each other and start informing one another. And then it's almost like once they're dry, the optically as they interact with light, that's how you end up receiving them. But how you get this sort of luminous quality, it actually is light refracting off different layers in different ways. And different, each paint has its own chemical composition. Red's got cadmium in it, or yellow does too, but it's a different one. You've got umbers, siennas. All of these things have different physical qualities that lead light to interact with them differently, especially as some of them have greater transparency than others. And so once you build that up, when you start seeing the gradations in her paintings that you see so beautifully in the sky, that comes from that. And then when you start seeing different forms kind of suggesting a structure underneath, that comes from that quality of working too.
And that sense of the ethereality, I think the work really suggests almost an airiness, which is so unusual in painting. And Pelton talked about wanting to paint as if the wings of a moth wings were putting paint on canvas. And it feels that way. It feels as if almost the paint has an airiness to it, which is makes it so luminous and magical.
And I think, one other thing is that these are, in working with that technique, she's actually ended up making very, very stable paintings. So even now seeing them, almost 100 years after they're made, there's no crackling on them. They still look like they're fresh out of somebody's studio. They glisten and they look almost wet still. And that's really because, she's a profound technician.
We are nearly running out of time, so I just wanted to preface our last question. We got a number of questions about Pelton's context and her relationship to the American Southwest, and how her work differed or how it was influenced by other artists in the Transcendental painting group. And particularly what the influence of this group was after she had been largely isolated from the mainstream art world. If you two could both speak.
By the time she met the group, there was a man named Dane Rudjar who had seen one of her exhibitions in New York and was the artist that introduced her to the New Mexico Transcendentalists. But by the time she really became a little bit involved with the group, she never met them. So it was all through letters, and she had already established her style, so that it wasn't as if they influenced her. And their work actually is much more geometric in many cases. Hers is much more ethereal, and also what marks her work as so different from any other abstraction that's being done at the time is that it's not just abstract, that she mixes these ethereal abstract forms with very recognizable images. And that's totally unique.
And I think notably within the Transcendental Painting Group, there's a real recognition from the members of just how important and impactful, or how important Pelton is for them. And they make her the first honorary president. But this was, as Barbara said, a kind of loosely affiliated group, and they did some exhibitions, but they really were only held together for about 5 years. There's kind of different endings of the group.
And so she really did paint alone. I mean, she was not a recluse. She had friends, but she didn't paint within a painting community. So she really developed her vocabulary totally on her own, as I said before, as a way to understand for herself or clarify for herself what she was experiencing in these dreams and meditations that she had.
We've had a number of seriously wonderful questions, including, I just wanted to shout out quickly to someone who wrote in from Cathedral City.
Oh, fantastic.
Wonderful. But I'll just pose one more, which is if you could speak to, some of our audience members are asking about more about her biography and what might have motivated her to move west, what might have her state of mind have been at that time. I think, Barbara, it's something you've just sort of been alluding to.
Right. Well, I think her early life was so overwhelmed by her father's death when she was only 9. And her father was obviously kind of a manic depressive. And then this sex scandal between her grandmother and this very famous abolitionist preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, that made the family excommunicated from the church. So it was a very religious family, but they had to practice religion outside of formal institutions. So that was one part of her life. She was a very frail young child, and she said she was prone to tears and breaking, very kind of insecure about herself. And I think that was one of the things that led her to look into occult literature and spiritual literature. And moving out to Cathedral City really occurred, I think, as I said before, there was this community of spiritualists in the American Southwest. So that would have been very appealing. And the desert itself, this empty, sort of open expanse, is something that allows, I think she felt, allowed the spirit to kind of soar and not be inhibited. So the idea of the light of the desert, the kind of quality of air, is something that she incorporated into the work. That soft air that comes in Southern California is part of our experience of her paintings.
And just as a biographical note, she didn't just move to California outright. She did spend a little bit of time there between 1928 and 29. She actually rented a house in Pasadena and really became immersed in this community that Barbara was talking about. And so had some experience of the place and kind of knew what she was getting into a little bit when she did decide to finally move to Cathedral City.
This has been wonderful. I wish we even had a little bit more time, but this concludes our program. And I wanted to thank again Barbara and Sarah and so much everyone for joining us tonight. You can please visit whitney.org for the full schedule of upcoming online events that we'll be hosting. And if you're planning to visit the museum in person, please remember to go online to book your tickets in advance and to review our new visitor policies. We hope to see you all again soon, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you all.